Welcome to Casual Friday. Hi, I'm Roxanne Richardson, and this is my weekly Casual Friday podcast. If you would like to jump right to a specific point in the video, you can mouse over or tap on your video playback screen, and you'll see the chapter titles and links to each section along that video timeline. Or you can use the timestamped links down in the video description. So this week I have 3 tidbits. I want to update you on a couple of projects I've been working on, and then I want to answer some questions about knitting math, knitting without a pattern, as well as designing and how to get started with that. So let's get started. The first tidbit that I have for you today is about an online knitting conference that is called Knitting History Forum. It's the annual general meeting and conference for 2020. Normally it's an in-person event, but with COVID-19 they can't do that, so it's an online event and it's free and you can join it from anywhere in the world. So you do have to register on Eventbrite, but I will leave links down in the description. So I'm going to leave links to the website for knitting history, and then in particular on a specific page on their website that kind of gives a general description of the topics that are going to be covered, and then they have a detailed schedule of events on the different talks they're going to be talking about, and it looks really interesting. I have signed up for it. I'm really excited to find out more about it, and again, it's going to be on November 7th. So the next thing I wanted to share with you was an article that came up in my feed this week. It's from Bloomberg.com, and it's small business Black-owned yarn stores are shaking up the industry. So the story centers on 3 women who are friends now. They didn't know each other several years ago. One of them owns a yarn shop in Brooklyn, New York. Her name is Felicia Eve of String Thing Studio. The other is Gaye I always want to say Glasspie. It's Glasspie. Gaye Glasspie, who you might have seen on social media as GGmadeit. She is famous for, I think she only knits with orange. Like, she loves orange and she looks great in it. So I can understand the appeal to her. So she's a designer and she has a blog and she's very active on social media. And then the third one is a woman named Adella Colvin, who's the owner of LolaBean, and she's an indie dyer in Georgia. So it's a story about how they happen to find each other and how their lives and businesses are being affected by the pandemic. So it was a really interesting article, and I'm going to leave that down in the description. I lied when I said I had 3 tidbits. I just have 2. So that's it for tidbits. All right, so I finished the sweater. Actually, I have a couple of ends still to weave in, and I haven't washed and blocked this yet. But I did sew all of the buttons on, and I thought I'd tell you a little bit about the techniques that I used for the buttonholes as well as the buttons. So what I used, let me unbutton one of these. What I used right here is a button, and I don't even think you can see it from where you are. I'll put a close-up photo up above on the screen. But I used what's called a 1-row buttonhole, and I did it from the wrong side of the work. I think it looks much better when you do it on the wrong side of the work than on the right side of the work. And I centered these buttons so that they were evenly spaced, and that the buttonhole was right on top of one of these knit 2 columns, and it extended into the purl columns. So they're framed and they're identically spaced apart so that it looks perfectly symmetrical once everything is buttoned up. So that's a type of buttonhole that I use, and I've done a video on how to do these types of buttonholes, which I will leave a link to above. What I did for sewing the buttons on is, because these buttons are kind of away from the surface of the fabric right here, they're standing up on their own, and I used what's called a thread shank. So these buttons are flat, and if I were to just sew them onto the fabric, they would be right up against the fabric here, and then when I wanted to button it together, it would really squeeze things. So this gives some room below the button. So, and I've done a video on this technique as well. If you use a button that has a shank, you wouldn't need to do this, but since these were flat buttons, I needed to create some space between the fabric and the button. Somebody did ask me if I am going to post some photos. They were intrigued by the construction process that I was discussing last week. So this was knit top down using what's called a simultaneous set-in sleeve technique. So all of the stitches were being worked at the same time, and so the set-in sleeves were being knit and created at the same time that all the shaping for the neck and everything was being done top down. This was a technique I chose to use because I was knitting this for my daughter, and her sizing and how she wanted it to fit, I wasn't completely convinced that that was going to be the end result, that I thought maybe I wanted to be able to easily add more length if I needed to, or remove length if things weren't exactly like she wanted. So I don't knit a lot of top-down sweaters. I really don't like the process of it. So I use that process, that construction method, when there's a definite advantage for it. Some people only knit top down and they really like it. The first top down sweater that I knit taught me a lot about how I do like things to fit. It taught me how deep I liked my armholes, and when I found that, you know, I used an existing sweater to figure out how deep I wanted the armholes. And what I realized as I was knitting it was, you know, that's actually baggier than I like. I would like it something that would fit a little snugger. So I was able to rip it back and redo the armhole depth and restart the sleeves and continue going from there. But once I knit that sweater and I determined how deep I like my armholes and how long I wanted my sweater and how I liked this and how I liked that, I didn't need to knit myself sweaters top down anymore because I had the information that I needed. I much prefer the process of knitting bottom up, and if I can, I like to knit the front and back separately. I just like working with smaller pieces, and I'm confident about what the results are going to be because I know how big I want all of those shapes to be. But if you're not sure, or you're using a specific construction method that you're not entirely sure how it's going to fit you, then working top down makes a lot of sense to me. And of course, if you just prefer that process to knitting bottom up, that's fine too. So after I've washed and blocked and done the final ends, I will post I'll leave a link down to the project page for this sweater. I always try to put the links to my project page down in the video description, and then as photos are added to it, you'd be able to see those. So I'm hoping that sometime in the next week I will be able to get those photos up there. So I wanted to give you a little update on this sweater here that I'm reverse engineering. This is a commercially knit sweater that was given to me about 20 years ago by my mother-in-law, and I really loved it. And after about 10 years, I got a big hole in the elbow, and I'm not interested in fixing it. Doesn't mean it's wrong to try to fix it. I'm just not interested, more interested in re-knitting something that's very much like this. So I've been talking about this in the past 3-4 weeks about the process of reverse engineering this. And there are some things I'm doing with this sweater that I don't or haven't done with reverse engineering in the past. So what reverse engineering means is that you take something that exists and then you figure out how it was done and then you recreate it. So in the past, when I've done reverse engineering, I have recreated something exactly, and I've only had photographs. So I would figure out what the stitch pattern is, I'd figure out what yarn weight it was, I'd look at the stitch counts and the row counts, and I completely recreate that item. I've done that with hats and I've done that with a sweater, and they turned out fine. And I learned a lot from that process by really looking at how the design came together. This is a sweater that I have in my possession, and I never really paid much attention to it while I was wearing it. I never laid it on my bed and really examined it. It's got cables, it's a cardigan, it's got pockets, I love it, and it's warm, and it's soft, it's made from cashmere, I loved it, and I didn't pay much attention to it. So as I've looked at it and figured out what all the component pieces are, I've realized, oh, there's certain elements that I want to keep, and some of them that kind of bug me from a design standpoint. Like if I'm going to actually knit this myself, I would want this to be somehow different. And as I've been talking about in the past few weeks, every time you think, oh, this is something that I would rather have, making that change has a ripple effect, and you start to realize, oh, well, if I change this, and that's going to affect this other thing. And so that's the kind of thing I'm trying to balance. One of the things that I've been thinking about a lot with this sweater is how I'm going to handle the pockets. So the way these pockets work is that the cable starts, after the ribbing transition, you get one of these cable crossings. It's really sort of a hybrid of a traveling cable and a basic stockinette rope cable. You have 3 of these stitches that travel over the course of 3 right side rows. So it takes 5 rows to make this crossing all the way. And then it continues up, and then you have this ribbed pocket top. Well, where this pocket top is, if that pocket wasn't there, there would have been another cable crossing coming across right here. And so you don't get that. And what you end up getting is kind of an hourglass shape within the pocket. And then the cable starts again after the pocket. And the pocket is also not completely centered on these 2 cables. It starts right at the edge here, and it ends a few stitches before here. So I've thought a lot about how I can change that so it's either centered better or something that's different about it. Somebody asked me in the Rocks group in the past couple of weeks if I could do a video on how to make pockets and do them neatly. And that was a kind of a request for like, oh, that is a really broad topic, and there's no way for me to do a video on pockets because there's so many different types, and each type has multiple ways of being executed. Some of them are going to be simple, and some of them are going to be more complex, but will give a more sophisticated finish and a nicer finish, but it'll just be fussier to do. And that's for each type of pocket, and there's tons of different types of pockets. So what I had done was I gave a recommendation of several knitting reference books that would include entire sections or chapters on pockets. And because I think that's really valuable to look at. And also for me, I find it valuable to look at more than one reference book, because not every book is going to have the same things in it. And when they do have the same things, they're not always going to explain them in the same way. They're not always going to have the same process. There's going to be some differences. So I was recommending those books, but I wanted to look in the 3 books I was thinking of to make sure that they had sizable sections on pockets. And as I did so, I was reminded of a specific type of pocket that I came across, I don't know, probably a year ago when I was looking through antique sweater patterns, and it was a man's sweater. It was probably from the World War I era or 1920s. One of the sweaters that I saw had a pocket. I was just reading the instructions, and I got to the instructions for the pocket, and I could not understand what they were talking about. So I did a swatch and kind of simulated what they were talking about, and then I was like, oh, I get it. So if you think about the kind of pockets that you have in your clothing, like if you think about your jeans, you will have a patch pocket on the back if you're a woman and if you have any pockets at all, and you have a patch pocket on the back. It's just a piece of fabric that is sewn to the back side of your jeans, and so that's a patch pocket. And you can do those in sweaters where you would just knit a piece, like a square piece of fabric, and you would sew it to the front of a sweater. Well, what we tend to do in sweaters, at least these days, is that we create what's called an inset pocket. So we create that same lining for the pocket, but we keep we don't bind it off. So we have something that's on 3 sides and it has live stitches at the top. And we knit something like that and we keep it on a double pointed needle until we have knit the front of the sweater all the way up to the top here. So you'd knit it all the way up and you'd knit your ribbing all the way across. So after you had done this and you'd done the ribbing, as you were working across this final row of ribbing, you would be binding off the stitches of the ribbing and then you'd finish the row. And then when you came back in the other direction, you would have that pocket lining that was on a needle and you would knit across those stitches and then continue across the rest of them. So you'd have this lining, you'd have this flap of fabric that was hanging down on the inside of the sweater, and then you would sew that down to the inside of the sweater. And so that creates a tidier result. There's an even tidier result that doesn't involve any sewing. That's my preferred way of making this style of pocket. But the style of pocket that I saw in this vintage or antique knitting book, and which is shown in these other general reference books, but you don't see very often nowadays, is a fully lined pocket. So now if you think about your jeans, and on the back you have that patch pocket, but think about the pockets that you have in the front if you have any. So what you have for those kind of pockets is an actual lining. It's like two pieces of fabric that are sewn together, creating like a little bag. And you have a pocket opening and that little bag is inserted in there. So it's made of a different fabric than your jeans. It's made of usually a pretty thin cotton fabric of some sort. So that's a fully lined pocket. That's a pocket and it just hangs loose inside your clothing. It's not physically attached anywhere except at the very top around the opening of the pocket. And so that is a really interesting pocket in a sweater construction, because the way that it is knit is that you would knit up to where you wanted the pocket opening. And in this case, you would knit across all of the stitches up to where the pocket was. And then you would you put those stitches on a holder and you'd put the stitches after the pocket opening on a holder. And you'd only be knitting those pocket stitches. And you would knit those pocket stitches to a length that was twice as long as you wanted the pocket to be deep. So if you wanted the pocket to be, let's say, 4 inches deep altogether, you would be knitting only those stitches and you would be knitting it for 8 inches in length. And what happens is that gets folded in half and it gets tucked inside the inside of the fabric. So you still have all of the live stitches, but now you've got this flap on the inside. And so now when you work across all of these stitches, and then you work across the pocket stitches and you work across here and you just keep working back and forth, back and forth. So now you have this flap on the inside of your sweater, but you do have to sew the sides of the flap because you've just knit a long rectangle. So I thought that was a really interesting pocket construction when I saw it in this old magazine or old knitting manual. And so when this person on Ravelry was asking me about pockets and I was looking through all my books, I saw that style of pocket in these books. What I was thinking was that it would be really great if I could knit these cables, could do that crossing, and I could do the second crossing up to the edge of this pocket. And then I could knit a lining that went on the inside, and then I could continue on so that all of these cable crossings were complete. There wouldn't be any need for ribbing because there wouldn't be an edge there. It's just a fold over, the fabric folds over the edge. So I'm really not terribly interested in seaming the sides of those pockets. But the main thing that I was wondering about is what that would be like in terms of thickness of fabric. Would that be too much fabric on the inside of the sweater? And so I did a little mock-up. I'm going to be ripping this out, not completely. I'm going to be ripping the actual pocket out and trying something else because this wasn't completely successful. So here is what the idea looks like. So you can see I've got the actual cable crossings on both of them. And then here's the opening right here and the pocket goes down inside there, and then I continue up the front. The problem that I had with this was that the pocket lining was knit in stockinette, which is wider than the stitches that are used for the stitch pattern. So I realized I had to figure out how to handle that difference in gauge. And then the other thing is I thought, oh, it might be neat to use the red. I have some red accents that I want to use on the sweater, and it might be fun to have the pocket be red instead of knitting this flap that went down like that. I would have that opening, but I would knit a pouch and then graft it on to the back and do attach on the front with a 3-needle bind off using this kind of cord. And because there's extra stitches there because of the cables, which narrows the fabric, when I did the 3-needle bind off here, it flares too much. So this is one idea. I took a class years ago from Fiona Ellis, who's a knitwear designer, and she does a lot of cables. And I took a class from her on designing with cables. One of the things that she was having us do was we basically just had fabric that was like ribbing. It was like knit 2, purl 3. And then she's like, okay, now just start making those ropes of stockinette move across the fabric however you want. And we're like, what? So we were experimenting with it, and she's like, if you get to a place where it's just not working, like the cables are not flowing, you don't like what you see, take a photograph of it. And then rip back to the point where you thought everything was going okay. So the photograph helps remind you, I already went on this path before, but also if you're not sure about whether you liked something or not, you have a record of it, and if you do like it, you can remember what you had done. So the amount of work it took to knit the gray part, all these cables, is significant enough that I don't want to do that again in order to try out a different pocket idea. So I'm going to take photos of it and take notes on what I did, take that pocket out, and then try something different to see if I can get a better fit or a better finish on that. That's my update for this week, and I actually really like the idea of this. And of being able to have the extra cable crossings going and just having the pocket just be there. And it actually doesn't feel as thick as I was afraid, in part because the pocket kind of is actually sitting in front. So the pocket extends out. I was afraid of just how it would feel, and I don't think it's too bad. That was my experiment for this week, was playing with a completely different idea for the pocket. So I wanted to talk about knitting math and knitting without a pattern and how to get started in design, because I've been getting a lot of questions in that realm lately. So I want to start with knitting math. I've had some requests for doing a video or some videos on knitting math. And that's, again, another topic, sort of like, can you do a video on pockets, where I'm like, what specifically do you mean by that? So this is a question for you guys. When you guys think about knitting math and the things that you stumble over and what it is that you want to know, or what frustrates you, or what you think is keeping you from going the next step or next level in knitting, what sort of math are you thinking about? So I did a video a few weeks ago on how to calculate or recalculate the shaping rate. Like if you have a different row gauge than what your pattern is stating, or if you need to change the length of something where there's a lot of shaping going on. Maybe you have very short arms, or you have long arms, or your row gauge is different. And so you need to recalculate how often you're doing your increases or decreases. I did do a video on that, which I'll link to up here. But I think that there's other places that people might be thinking of when they're talking about math. And so I'm going to throw out a couple of ideas and see, and don't just say, oh, yes, 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 do something like that. Tell me what it is that it's frustrating you, or what seems mysterious to you, so that I can figure out how to aim those sorts of videos or topics. I think one of the most common knitting math mysteries is when you get an instruction in a pattern that will say increase 4 stitches evenly across the row. Or in some cases, it could be a lot more stitches. You might have like 113 stitches already, and they'll tell you to increase 50 stitches and evenly, and they don't tell you how to do that. One of the reasons they don't tell you how to do that is because there's not a good way to express that in terms of knit 2, increase 1, knit 1, increase 1. There's not a good way to write all that out, which is why they tell you to increase evenly. So there are a couple of different ways you can do that, and it's for whether you're increasing or decreasing. So that I can see as a topic for a technique video that people might be interested in. But I'm wondering what else people think about when they're thinking about knitting math. So I want to talk about how you can go about learning to design. This is going to mean different things to different people, and they're going to have different they're going to be picturing different things when they say they want to learn how to design. I'm going to talk about these different sort of areas of design, and then give you some resources that might help you kind of achieve those particular goals. The way that a lot of people get started is by modifying things. And they might be modifying things to get a better fit. Maybe they need more room or less room or more length or something. So they're learning how to adjust different parts of the design. They're not trying to change the design, they're just trying to change the dimensions, or they're trying to change the shape of the design so that it will fit their body. So for those kinds of things, you need to understand gauge, you need to understand stitching row gauge, and you need to understand how shaping is achieved. So, and you can practice this on paper. So you can draw a shape on a piece of paper and just make up some dimensions, and then look at like a stitch and row gauge that maybe you're using in your existing pattern, and figure out how many stitches in the stitch pattern that you're using would you need in order to get the first width. How many stitches are you going to need to get that second width later? And then how long do you want that change to occur over? So how many rows is that? And then go through the process of, okay, well, how would I do the shaping on this? How would I space that shaping out? That's the first step, is understanding how gauge is used to knit something to a specific shape. When you understand that, then you can make those kinds of modifications to your garments. But the other kinds of modifications that can be really easy are just, well, I want to use a different stitch pattern, or I want to use a different kind of ribbing, or I want to make something to be a cardigan rather than having it be a pullover. And so you're using that design, you're just changing certain elements of it. So those are things that you look at other patterns, like a pattern that has the thing that you want. How did they do that? What, you look at the schematic, and how is that? How many inches across was that? How deep was that? How was that constructed? So you look at existing patterns as a reference point. Another type of knitting that is related to design is learning how to knit something without a pattern. So a year ago, well, it was in December, so not quite a year ago, I published a video called How to Knit a Hat Without a Pattern. Hats are one of the simplest types of items there are to knit, because it's a tube that's closed at the top. But it includes different elements that require you to transition from one to another. You start with some kind of ribbing. Then you transition into whatever you're using for the body. And in this case, it's stockinette, because if you are learning something like this, it's helpful not to have to also deal with a stitch pattern. And then how do you shape that crown? How do you decide how to work those decreases for the crown of the hat? So I talked about how to measure, and how to do your gauge swatch so you know how many stitches you have. And then things to consider when you are transitioning from the ribbing to the stockinette to the crown decreases, so that you have the numbers that you need in order to work each of those sections. And that whole process works exactly the same regardless of how big that head is that you need to knit for, and regardless of what kind of yarn you're using and what gauge that yarn is knit at. So there isn't a, well, this is how many stitches you need to cast on with this needle. That's not what it's about. It's about you taking a skein of yarn from your stash. It's bulky weight. What does the gauge on the label recommend? Oh, it recommends 3 to 3.5 stitches per inch. Okay, and they recommend a needle to get that. Well, what needle do I need in order to get that recommended gauge? So you figure out what needle you need, and once you find out what your actual gauge is, then you can use that in combination with the measurements that you've taken in order to determine how many stitches you need to cast on. So it's that kind of going through that kind of process. So there are a lot of formulas that are used in knitting that knitters, once you've had experience with things, you realize, oh, it's helpful if I have a multiple of 8 stitches before I start the crown decreases. Okay, well, I don't have a multiple of 8 before the crown, so I do a round where I do some decreases to get me down to that, and then I can do that standard way of doing my crown decrease. So you start to learn these tricks, and you don't need a pattern because you understand what to do at each section. You're not designing, you're just knitting without a pattern. So this is something that I do all of the time when I'm knitting socks. I'm not using a pattern. I knit socks for a lot of different people. Each of those people has different foot measurements. So I need to know what those measurements are, and then whatever yarn I'm using, it might be a slightly different gauge, I have to figure out how many stitches I need to cast on for that person. And so then I knit my leg, and then there are formulas for how you knit your heels, but not all heels fit all people. So you either have to figure out what kind of heel is going to fit that person, or you can take additional measurements, and knowing how this formula with the dimensions that are created from that particular type of heel, you can predict whether or not that heel is going to fit that person, and then that you will need to make modifications, and then how can you make those modifications. That is a process that I did this. It was called the August Sock Knit Along, and it wasn't this summer, it was the summer of 2019. And it was basically, it's a tutorial that walked you through how to do the measurements, how to predict where the problems were going to be, and walked people through how you create a custom fit sock for somebody. And it goes through the entire process. I think the documentation is probably 50 pages altogether. It's basically like a book. It's like a reference book for how to create socks in different ways, depending on what kind of heel you want to knit, and how to modify it to fit anybody. And you're not just, limited to using this heel for this person and that heel for this other person, because of this person has a high arch and that person has flat feet. So those are the kinds of things where you start with, where you understand what the formulas are and how you can modify them. And that way, when you are using somebody else's pattern, oh, here I'm going to need to modify it in this way when I get to it. Or you can say, oh, I want to design my own. I'm going to pick out stitch patterns. I'm going to do this. I'm going to do that. I'm going to mix and do all of these different kinds of things, and then actually design something with that understanding of what the formulas and the process of construction are. Years ago, almost 25 years ago, I bought a knitting machine when my first daughter was just like a year old. Bought a knitting machine, and I bought software that went with it. It was called Design a Knit, and that software still exists, and it's still available for machine knitters and hand knitters if you have a Windows machine. And what it is software that has basic schematics for basic types of sweaters and that sort of thing. And what you input into it is what your gauge is, and you pick out what size you want, and you can make some modifications in certain ways. But it's creating a schematic based on the size that you are choosing, and then you give it your gauge information. And then you can kind of knit a pattern from that. You can knit a sweater from that. There is another piece of software that was available, and it's not anymore because the person who did it, she's retired, that was called Sweater Wizard. So you pick a particular size. I have 36-inch bust and I want just sort of standard amount of ease. I want a set-in sleeve. I want this thing. I want that thing. And it would have sort of the standard schematic for that particular size, and then you could tweak it and you could say, I want to put in waist shaping, or I want to do this, or I want to do that, or whatever it is you want to do. You had to know something about modifications in order to tweak it in that way. And it would give you this very bare bones set of instructions that allowed you to knit using that. That kind of system where you had these sort of standard shapes, like I want to knit something for a 2-year-old. Well, here, and I want it to have a V-neck. Okay, here you go. What's your gauge? And here's how you do it. That is the kind of concept that the Ann Budd books are based on. This is the Knitter's Handy Book of Sweater Patterns, but she also has this first one, which is the Knitter's Handy Book of Patterns, and this has all kinds of things. It's got hats, it's got scarves, it's got mittens, gloves, sweaters, so all of the basic kinds of things. And then it tells you how to knit something based on if you have a gauge of 3 stitches per inch, which is like a bulky weight gauge, up to 7 stitches per inch, which is fingering weight. So it's for a 2-year-old up to extra large adult in all this range of stitch gauges. Now the problem with this, one problem would be that they don't take row gauge into account. They're using sort of the average row gauge that most yarns would have based on that stitch gauge. And so shaping for things like sleeves and stuff is going to be based on that. But this is a way to start. This gives you a template that you can lay whatever stitch patterns you want on top of. And she does give information about, well, if you're not using a gauge that's 3 stitches an inch or 4 stitches an inch or 5 stitches an inch, how you go about doing that, and how you can make some other kinds of modifications. So this one is nice because it's got all different kinds of things that you can start with, and she does give you options for like necklines, or if you're doing a hat, different types of cuffs and stuff. There are certain things that she does the same for everything. Like for socks, it's, she uses a specific formula, and that formula isn't going to fit somebody like me, and she doesn't tell you how to modify. So these are the things that are based on the formulas for how to knit things, but it's not going to help you if you need to modify something for a good fit, but it's a starting point. So she has this handy book of patterns, and then she's got this handy book of sweater patterns, which are bottom up and seamed sweaters. And then more recently she did this version that's for top-down sweaters. And again, these are going to be based on using specific types of formulas, and you still may need to figure out how to do modifications if you have a fit issue. Some other books that are in that kind of same vein are like the Elizabeth Zimmermann's books. She wrote like Knitting Without Tears. And so she has the system that's called the EPS, Elizabeth Percentage System, where you can figure out, how big around, based on your chest size, then the percentage of that measurement that would be needed for the neck or the arms, whatever. And it's an average thing, and it's going to work for a lot of people, but it's not going to work for everyone. So again, there's the thing that it's a starting point, so that you can get your creative ideas out there. But knitting is a learning process. And every sweater I make, I'm like, okay, that worked out pretty well. I think next time I'm going to do this. So I don't know if I've knit a perfect sweater yet. I don't know that I ever will, but I certainly have knit plenty of sweaters that are good enough. Barbara Walker's book, Knitting from the Top, was written in 1972, so some of the proportion stuff is based on 70s fit things, but she has patterns or processes. They're not patterns, processes for knitting sweaters, skirts, all kinds of things, not just sweaters. It does require having some kind of experience and understanding about how these things are constructed in general, so that you can, adapt to this particular process. Very good book. Then you have this book, which is called Knitting in the Old Way. It's Priscilla, Gibson-Roberts, and this is the second edition with Deborah Robson giving some input into the expanded edition. And what this is traditional types of sweaters. And so it could be an Aran sweater, it could be a Fair Isle sweater, it could be, all kinds of different traditional sweaters, which tend to be simply shaped, but it talks about what the elements are that are part of that tradition, and then how to, like, what percentage of, like, how a yoke, for example, is constructed, one that just goes to the shoulder versus one that goes all the way to the underarm, and what those percentages are, and how to do short rows, the approach for short rows depending on what kind of yoke they're doing. And so it has all of these different types of basic sweaters in here, and how to construct a sweater based on that, and also incorporate what's considered the traditional elements and construction process of those particular traditional sweaters. So this is another one where you have to do quite a bit of thinking about, but it gives you a starting point. So now I want to talk about design, and what is the difference, like, in my mind, not everybody may agree with this, but what is the difference between designing something and knitting something without a pattern? Because there is overlap with this. In order to design something, you have to have that foundation of how do I knit something without a pattern, because you are the one creating the pattern. But knitting something without a pattern isn't necessarily the same thing as designing. So let me pull out some things from this bin. Okay, so these are just some hats. So this is a basic hat. I think this is one of the hats that I used in that How to Knit a Hat Without a Pattern book. I would not say I designed this hat. I would say I knit this hat without a pattern. I used my knowledge of what the formulas were, and along with my gauge and the measurements that I wanted to use, and I knit this hat. These three hats were designed. So when you are using a stitch pattern like this, one way of going from one element to another is to just treat them as their own thing. I'm going to use ribbing. I want knit 2 purl 2 ribbing. I'm going to do that for 2 inches. Okay, now I'm going to switch to whatever I'm going to do for the body of the pattern. I'm going to do that for 3 inches. Okay, now I need to do the crown shaping. I'm going to use this one way of crown shaping, and I'm going to do it all in stockinette because I can't figure out how to make the stitch pattern continue into that. You're laying different stitch patterns on each section without being concerned about how they transition into them. So this is a hat. This is a mock cable hat that I designed a few years ago. So you can see in this hat that I have some elements in the ribbing that I stop those elements, but they transition into what's going on in the mirrored mock cables above them. Everything lines up perfectly and flows into those, and then I continue that up into the point where I'm doing the crown shaping. So to think about this, how am I going to do that? How am I going to make all of this flow? So that's design. That is when you aren't just using the formulas to create a shape, but that you are also manipulating the stitch patterns or combining stitch patterns that are going to work well and in a thoughtful way. So that would be what I would consider designing. So I have a few books that I think can help with designing. These are more helpful for sweater knitting, I think, than other types of items, but I will get to other types of items. So one of the books is called Designing Knitwear by Deborah Newton, and she talks about all kinds of things, like when you are trying to develop stitch patterns, for example, and how to experiment with those in order to get a result that you like. The section on lace in here was revelatory to me, but she also talks about the challenges of fitting things to body sizes that are more challenging. For example, 2 larger people are larger in different ways. They don't have the same fit issues, and how different ways that she approached solving those fit issues for different people. And she talks about using mock-ups as well, so that you can get an idea of how something's going to fit and how to get that silhouette figured out without having to actually knit it by hand first. So she's an actual like trained designer, and she designs for commercial in knitwear designers, but she also designs for hand knitters. And I've taken a class from her. She's really good. Another book that's really good for sweaters is Sweater Design in Plain English by Maggie Righetti, right here. And so there's no color photographs, there's a lot of drawings and things, but it's all this information about how to measure, where to measure, how to calculate, set in sleeves, how to do this, how to do that. So this is a really valuable reference. I haven't designed a sweater like from start to finish using this book, but a lot of people do. I use this as a reference, like how are these types of necklines done? And I'll go look in all my books and see how everybody does and kind of figure out, this is the one I want to go with, or that's an interesting idea. So I like to compile all the different ideas that I get from the different books. But for specific types of like accessories, like mittens or hats or something like that, I find getting books that have patterns in them but have a reference section in them is really helpful. There are a lot of different regions of the world that have their own traditional style of mitten, and they have different approaches for how those are constructed. So that can be really interesting. Whether or not you want to knit something or design something that's in that traditional way is just to see how all of the different traditions approach it, so you can see that all the options that you have when it comes to constructing or designing something. I have a lot of different mitten books and I have a lot of sock books because those are things that I tend to be interested in. And so a lot of times these types of books also give you hints on how to combine stitch patterns. Like I have a book on the art of fair Allen knitting by Anne Feidelson, on this one right here. And the section on color theory and the examples of swatches that showed how using the same stitch pattern and how using colors that were too similar in color value, how they don't show up, and then how to go about choosing those colors, was really informative. So that's a different area of design, is selecting stitch patterns that go together, but also with color work, how to figure out how to combine colors and how to anticipate whether colors are going to work together. So there's a lot more to design than just how do I knit that shape that, using the stitch pattern I have. There's also how do I combine other elements like color or texture or things like that. So for me, when I want to learn how to knit a particular kind of thing, or if I have an idea for something, like I wonder what that would be like, or I wonder how to incorporate this kind of element, I go on Ravelry, I look at patterns, I look through my books, I look to see what's been done before. Because nobody comes up with something that's completely original. You're always adapting based on something else that's come before. Nobody's inventing a system of 3 tubes that are connected together to create a garment for human beings. We've already figured that out. What we're doing is finding different stitch patterns or different shapings or different ways to make all those things come together, different direction of construction, all of those kinds of things. And so that is what design is about, it's learning how to incorporate all of those things together. So you might only be interested in how to knit a hat without a pattern because you've got gift knitting and you've got a bunch of yarn in your stash. You don't care about, fancy design elements, and that's fine. That's completely legitimate. Most of the socks I knit are completely based on that philosophy of, I just want to use this fun yarn and I don't want to think too much about what I'm doing. I don't want to have to keep following a pattern. I want to just be able to knit. So it's really a freeing thing to be able to knit that way. And I would encourage you guys to try it out for yourself. Oh, another resource that is really good is TKGA, the Knitting Guild Association. They are the organization, it's a nonprofit organization specifically created to educate knitters. That is their whole purpose. So they are the ones that developed the Master Hand Knitting program that I went through a number of years ago. But they have many, many, many other courses that can help you learn more about how knitting works, because the more you understand about how knitting works, the more you're going to understand how to create something that's in your head that you want to see come out of your needles. They're correspondence courses, and so you work at your own pace, and when you're done, you mail your submissions in. In most cases, you're not being judged. The teacher will give you feedback and you can interact with them, and the point is to learn. The Master Hand Knitting program is different. That's something where the committee is going to go through every single thing you did. This passes, this doesn't, and you are being judged. Like you have to reach a particular level. That is not true for most of the other classes. It's a learning opportunity for you to get feedback on your knitting from somebody who is really an expert. If you guys have any questions about the things I've talked about in terms of these areas of design that you might be interested in, please let me know down in the comments. Well, that's it for this week's Casual Friday. If you have any comments or questions about today's video or suggestions for videos you'd like to see in the future, you can leave those down in the comments below or join the discussion in my Ravelry group, Rocks. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next week.